Welcome to today's fourth Insider Threat podcast. Today we'll be talking about Active Directory permissions attacks and how to protect against them. I'm your host, Jonathan Sander, CTO here at StealthBits, and joining me today again is Jeff Warren, SVP of Technical Product Management. Jeff, thanks for being here. How are you doing today?
Good. Thanks for having me.
All right. So I'll give a little intro for Jeff. Jeff is a cybersecurity veteran. He's been in the trenches with our customers and more for many, many years. And he's specifically an expert on Active Directory and Active Directory permissions. Now, normally I dive right in, but this topic today, I think it deserves a little bit more introduction. So Jeff, I'll ask you to throw some thoughts in here. Why Active Directory permissions? Why is this something that we're paying so much attention to, and why do we think others should do the same?
Yeah, so we decided to take a look at how attackers can take advantage of Active Directory permissions because it's something that everybody struggles with. Everybody who uses Active Directory relies on permissions to secure their users, their groups, their computers, and all of their sensitive objects. And the other scary thing about them is anybody can access these permissions. All it takes is a little bit of knowledge and some PowerShell. And you can see all the permissions and find the vulnerabilities that you want to exploit. So you don't need privileged access to begin to plan out an attack against Active Directory permissions. And over the years, most companies don't manage their permissions well and eventually leave themselves vulnerable to these types of attacks. So we looked at a few specific ways that attackers could discover these weaknesses and exploit them.
Right, and so it's kind of fun, right? When we dive into these permissions attacks, like with a lot of other attacks that we've looked at, there are some scary tools out there, and the one that's the scariest, it seems, to a lot of people is something called BloodHound, right? Which basically takes these permissions you're talking about and with no permission can lay out a map. And I mean, when I say a map, a very visual map, if you haven't seen the screenshots in Jeff's blogs. Now, here's the question I have for you. Is that really as magical as it seems, right? Because it's when you see it laid out the way it does, it really feels like there's something amazing going on. And I don't mean just like the graphics. Obviously, a dashboard's a dashboard, but those permissions and understanding the relationships between those permissions, is that as magical as it seems?
Yeah, I think it is. And in my environment, in my screenshots that you're referring to, it was simplified. I was looking at specific attack paths, whether it's resetting passwords or changing group memberships. In real organizations, it's going to be more complex than that. And you're going to be involving multiple permission attacks and many, many more steps. But it takes this gigantic mound of hard to use permissions data that can be very complex and paints out a very simple path, kind of like using Google Maps to understand how to get from point A to point B. So, magical could be a word to use for it. It definitely makes a hard, complex problem very easy for an attacker.
But what about the underlying data that it uses, right? I mean, that data is sort of there for the taking, right? It's just a matter of taking it and laying it out the way that BloodHound does. Yeah,
any user that can bind to Active Directory can pull back the permissions, the ACLs. It's just another property of an object. So to dump all the permissions and feed them into BloodHound, anybody can do it, which is what makes it particularly scary. You can go from a non-privileged user, plan out an attack path for that user, and begin to perpetrate it within minutes.
Right. Now, some of this AD permission stuff gets a little obscure. And what I mean by that is that, you have to be a real AD nerd to understand a lot of what's going on in here. That's kind of the point. There's all this power that's hidden. One of the things that I know is not a very well-known AD feature is this AdminSDHolder stuff that we address in your piece. Now, here's the question I have for you is, have you seen Microsoft drawing attention to this very important part of Active Directory over the years? And by the way, I'll just the briefest word, AdminSDHolder, essentially is like a permissions template for your most sensitive objects in AD, for your most sensitive groups. And just hearing that description should already go, wow, that sounds pretty important. And you'd imagine there'd be a lot of attention on it, but there doesn't seem to be. Have you seen a lot of attention being tried to draw this and just people not listening? Or is it something that's obscure, like for real? Is it not getting the attention it should?
There's a little bit of attention being paid, but certainly not enough. I mean, AdminSDHolder is something that an attacker can use once they've performed the attack to make sure they never get kicked out of a domain and never lose access to their most privileged, protected users and groups out there. And if you read on TechNet, you're certainly going to find a couple articles about it. But even on TechNet, a lot of the information, it's outdated now. It was written when this came out in 2000, so 17 years ago when this feature was introduced, and it's changed over the years. And some of what's there on TechNet no longer applies to the more modern Active Directory systems. So I think there is not enough information out there on AdminSDHolder and SD-prop, which is used to push out those permissions to the protected users. And if you don't really understand it, it's going to be really hard to know an attacker is taking advantage of it and undo it.
Yeah. Now, another thing that was definitely on the obscure side, something I learned, by the way, that I didn't know about before you wrote about it, was the nature of this adminCount attribute on groups. Can you talk a little bit about what's the history of that? Like, why is it there? And we talk about sort of the magic setting when that attribute is set to 1, but talk to me about when it's not set to 1 as well. What does it mean to not have that set to 1?
Yeah, so adminCount, that's one of the things that, if you read the TechNet article, it's changed a bit over the years. So when in Windows 2000, when this feature was introduced, they had an attribute on any object called adminCount. It can be 1 or 0. That's about it. And it's supposed to say, is this object protected? Is this an administrative object, whether it's a user or a group? So domain admins and the well-known sensitive groups, they by default have adminCount of 1. Any user or group that gets added to them, they get adminCount 1 assigned as well. The way it used to work is the AdminSDHolder permissions would get pushed down to anybody with adminCount set to 1. Since then, that's changed. That's no longer how it works, and it makes it a little bit more complicated. Now, it will only get pushed down to current members of these groups, because what used to happen is you remove a user from domain admins, adminCount does not get set to 0. It stays as 1. So you get these kind of orphaned administrator accounts floating out there that once were an admin protected, now they no longer are, but they still have adminCount equals 1. So it became a little messy, and it still is. It's just one of those buried little secrets of Active Directory that make it hard to understand. But if you're an attacker and you need to understand where the administrative accounts are, filtering objects to adminCount equals 1 gives you a really good head start on that. Those are either current or past admin accounts. The only other value can be is 0, which means this account is not and never has been an administrator in this environment.
Now, it's funny, the orphan phenomenon. I was reading not only your stuff, but I did go digging through TechNet. And what occurred to me was, if I was an attacker, I would definitely be interested specifically in people who had adminCount set to 1, but were no longer part of those sensitive groups, because they might also have other rights accrued that would be really interesting, and they're not as visible, right? Because you're really paying attention to everybody's in your domain admins group, enterprise admins group, but not so much those folks that are not, right? So they are particularly interesting. And again, you taught me that one this time, so that's cool. So last but not least, let's get away from the obscure and talk about something I think most people watching this will be aware of, and that's the notion of unconstrained delegation, right? So this has been a known security risk with Active Directory for a long time. But we talk about how we can, or rather you talk about how we can approach that problem with a new set of eyes. But the question I have for you, a little bit different than what you wrote about. So if you're talking to a customer about this, how would you recommend that they migrate away from unconstrained delegation to a more limited model? In other words, so if they know they've got it out there and they want to get away with it or want to get away from it rather, because they know it's a problem, how would you tell them to go about there? Is there a systematic way that they can say every unconstrained delegation can become this kind of more limited, or here's the steps you would take? How would you advise them to get away from it, other than get away? How would you advise them on how?
Yeah, so this is another older legacy feature that realized is not very secure and started to move away from it, but they keep it there for backwards compatibility. So unconstrained delegation, a computer can impersonate any user to any service. It stores TGTs that can be stolen very easily by an attacker. They then later introduced constrained delegation. And basically what you want to do is, if you're using unconstrained, you have to determine exactly what servers and what services on those servers your computer needs to impersonate to, whether it's communicating to a database on another server or through web services over HTTP. If you can find that out, you can then flip the switch to constrained delegation, specify the services on the server you need, and everything will keep working, but you've got way, way better security. You don't have nearly the amount of risk that you used to have, but there's no automated way to do that. It's a case-by-case basis. So if you're a customer who has thousands of applications or hundreds of applications that have this feature turned on, you have to look at each of them one by one and figure out, what is this doing and how do I move from unconstrained to a constrained model?
And even just getting the information about what services are out there and what they use can be difficult, unless, say, you have a platform that lays that kind of data out for you. But we'll just leave everyone curious as to what that might be. Okay, so that was all the questions I had for this week. So thanks, Jeff, for joining us. Again, this is the StealthBits Insider Threat Podcast, and we're trying to, we were talking this week about how organizations can protect themselves from these Active Directory permissions attacks. If you'd like to learn more, stealthbits.com, go to the blogs, check out what Jeff has wrote, and you'll find information as well as a webinar that goes with it. And you'll also find our Security Best Practices Assessment, which is going to allow you to apply some of the StealthBits technology to solving some of these problems. All right. Hopefully you've learned something here today. Like I said, Jeff taught me something. Thanks again, Jeff, for your help this week and with the blog series.
My pleasure, as always.
All right. And that's all for this week. Bye, everybody.